Chapter 10. Before we get into Chapter 10, I want to take a moment and just say a little bit about Mark Twain's narration style here. It's written first person, limited viewpoint. Never Huck is talking. It's I. It's not Huck then does this. It's I do this. Except for Mark Twain would not say I do this. He might, but he's just as likely to say I does this. When Jim is talking, there's a great deal of phonetic spelling and automatopoeia. Less so with Huck, but it's still there in the reading. And if you're a person that enjoys the wordsmithing, the crafting of language, certainly you should pick up Huck Finn and read the words rather than relying on my interpretation of what Mark Twain is trying to have his characters say. Because honestly, that's part of the stuff that I'm struggling with in reading this. I'm looking at the word and I'm trying to deduce what the word is supposed to be and still read it aloud in a way that doesn't interrupt the flow of the conversation and doesn't make a mockery of it. And I don't know if the struggle is apparent. I suspect it probably is, but it's apparent to me. Whenever I get to one of the characters speaking aloud, I stumble at making those sentences flow the way they would flow with my eyes. They certainly go through my eyes much better than they come out of my mouth. But we stumble on. So, Chapter 10. After breakfast, I wanted to talk about the dead man and guess how he come to be killed, but Jim didn't want to. He said it would fetch bad luck, and besides, he said, he might come to haunt us. He said that a man that weren't buried was more likely to go a-haunting around than another one that was planted and comfortable. That sounded pretty reasonable, so I didn't say no more. But I couldn't help but studying over it and wishing I'd known who shot the man and what they'd done it for. We rummaged the clothes we got and found $8 in silver sewn up in the lining of the old blanket overcoat We'd rummaged the clothes we'd got and found $8 in silver sewn up in the lining of an old blanket overcoat. Jim said he reckoned that the people in the house had stole the coat, because if they'd have known the money was there, they wouldn't have left it. I said I reckoned they killed him too, but Jim didn't want to talk about that. I says, now you think it's bad luck, but what did you say when I fetched in the snakeskin that I'd found on the ridge before yesterday? You said it was the worst luck in the world to touch a snakeskin with my hand. Well, here's your bad luck. We've raked in all this truck and $8 besides. I wish we could have bad luck like this every day, Jim. Never you mind, honey, never you mind. Don't you get too apart. It's a-comin'. Mind I tell you, it's a-comin'. It did come, too. It was a Tuesday that we had that talk. Well, after dinner on Friday, we was laying around in the grass at the upper end of the ridge and got out of tobacco. I went to the cavern to get some and found a rattlesnake in there. I killed him, curled him up on the foot of Jim's blanket, ever so natural, thinking there'd be some fun when Jim found him. Well, by night I forgot all about it, and when Jim flung himself down on the blanket, while I struck a light, the snake's mate was there and bit him. He jumped up a-yellin', and the first thing the light shows was the varmint curled up ready for another spring. I laid him out in a second with a stick, and Jim grabbed Pat's whiskey jug and began to pour it down. He was barefooted, and the snake bit him on the right heel. That all comes of my being such a fool not to remember that whenever you leave a dead snake, its mate always comes around there and curls around it. Jim told me to chop off the snake's head and throw it away, and then skin the body and roast a piece of it. I'd done it, and he ate it, and said it would help cure him. He made me take off the rattles and tie him around his wrist, too. He said that would help. Then I slid out quiet and throwed the snakes clear away among the brushes, for I weren't going to let Jim find out it was all my fault. Not if I could help it. Jim sucked and sucked at the jug, and now and then he got out of his head and pitched around and yelled. But every time he'd come to himself, he went to sucking the jug again. Well, his foot swelled up pretty big. So did his leg. By and by the drunk began to come, so I judged he was all right. But I'd rather been bit with a snake than Pabst whiskey. Jim was laid up for 4 days and nights. Then the swelling was all gone, and he was around again. I made up my mind I wouldn't ever take hold of snakeskin again with my hands, now that I'd seen what had come of it. Jim said he reckoned I would believe him the next time. He said that handling the snakeskin was such awful bad luck that maybe we even got to the end of it. He said he'd rather see the new moon over his left shoulder as much as 1,000 times than take up a snakeskin in his hand. Well, I was getting to feel that way myself, though I've always reckoned that looking at the new moon over your left shoulder is one of the carelessness and foolishness things a body can do. Old Hank Bunker done it once, and bragged about it. In less than 2 years, he got drunk and fell off the shot tower and spread himself out so that he was just kind of a layer, as you might say. They slid him edgeways between 2 barn doors for a coffin, and buried him just so. That's what they say. I didn't see it. Pap told me. But anyway, it all come from looking at the moon that-a-way, like a fool. Well, the days went along, and the river went down between the banks again, and about the first thing we done was to bait one of the big hooks with a skinned rabbit and set it and catch a catfish that was as big as a man, being 6 foot 2 inches long and weighed over 200 pounds. We couldn't handle him. Of course, he'd have flung us all the way to Illinois, so we just sat there and watched him rip up and tear around till he drowned. We found a brass button in his stomach and a round ball, and lots of rubbish. We split the ball open with a hatchet, and there was a spool in it. Jim said he had been there a long time to cut over and over and make a ball of it. As big a fish that ever was catched in the Mississippi, I reckon. Jim said he ain't never seen one bigger. He would have been worth a good deal over in the village. They peddle out such fish as that by the pound at the market house there. Everybody buys some of him. His meat's as white as snow and makes a good fry. Next morning, I said it was getting slow and dull, and I wanted to get stirring things up some way. I said I reckoned I would slip over to the river and find out what was going on. Jim liked that notion, but he said I must go in the dark and look sharp. Then he studied it over and said couldn't I put on some of the old things and dress up like a girl? That was a good notion, too. So we shortened up one of the calico gowns, and I turned up my trouser legs to my knees and got into it. Jim hitched it behind with the hooks, and it was a fair fit. I put the sunbonnet on and tied it under my chin, and then for a body to look in and see it, my face was then for a body to look in and see when my face was looking down, like the joint of a stovepipe. Jim said nobody would know it was me, even in the daytime hardly. I practiced around all day to get the hang of things, and by I could do it pretty well in them. Only Jim said I didn't walk like a girl. He said I must quit pulling down my gown to get my breeches pocket. I took notice, and I done better. I started up the Illinois shore in the canoe just after dark. I started across the town from below the ferry landing, and the drift of the current fetched me in at the bottom of the town. I tied up and started down the bank. There was a light burning in this little shanty that hadn't been lived in for a long time, so I wondered who might be up there in the quarters. I slipped up and peeped in at the window. There was a woman about 40-year-old knitting by a candle that was on a pine table. I didn't know her face, and she was a stranger, for you couldn't start a face in that town that I didn't know. Now, this was a lucky thing, because I was weakening. I was getting afraid that I had come. People might know my voice and find me out. But if this woman had been in town for just a few days, she could tell me all that she wanted to know. So I knocked at the door and made up my mind I wouldn't forget I was a girl.